June 16, 1942. Chesapeake Bay, Virginia. The tide lapped quietly against the hull of a brand-new cargo ship, painted battleship gray, its steels still smelling of heat and flux from the welding torches that had shaped it only days before. Workers stood along the pier in worn overalls, their faces streaked with sweat and soot, watching in silence as a Navy tug nosed a blunt bow away from the slip. The ship looked ungainly, fat, slab-sided with a single tall funnel and a deck crowded by derricks and winches. To the men who built it, she was something almost ordinary. To the officers of the German Kriegsmarine, who would one day read her name in intercepted convoy reports, she was a symbol they didn't yet understand. SS Patrick Henry, the first Liberty ship to join the war. In Berlin, a few months later, a naval attached laughed when a junior officer mentioned these emergency freighters. Crude, he said, slow, barely armed, the Kriegsmarines whose boats would feast on them. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, father of the U-boat wolfpacks, shared the dismissive tone. The Americans will drown themselves in their own bad engineering, on German propaganda. Posters, the clumsy silhouette of the Liberty ship was mocked as a floating coffin, hastily built, destined for the bottom. But what German intelligence missed in 1942 was not just a ship, it was the mobilization of an entire industrial civilization. The Patrick Henry's launch had been an experiment. The United States Maritime Commission needed cargo ships faster than any shipyard had ever built them. Britain was desperate. Germany's submarine campaign was strangling the Atlantic lifeline. Merchant ships were going down faster than they could be replaced. Britain's food and fuel reserves were dropping toward catastrophe. The answer was an idea that seemed crude but would prove revolutionary. A standardized cargo vessel, welded instead of riveted, with components manufactured like car parts in plants scattered across the country. A ship that could be assembled not by master shipwrights, but by thousands of newly trained men and women welders, fitters, electricians who 6 months earlier had been clerks, farmers, and homemakers. Henry J. Kaiser, the maverick industrialist already famous for building dams and bridges, promised the impossible: turn shipbuilding into assembly line work. If we can build a dam in a river, we can build a ship on land, he told skeptical naval planners. Skeptical was an understatement. Generations of shipbuilders knew that an ocean-going freighter took at least 8 to 12 months to construct. Kaiser said he could do it in 60 days. By the end of 1942, his West Coast yards proved him right, and then some. The SS Robert E. Peary, built in Richmond, California, slid down the ways just for days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after her keel was laid, an act that stunned even the men who had welded her seams. It wasn't a stunt. It was a signal. America could build faster than Germany could sink. German U-boat captains began to notice the change first. Convoy reports that had once shown merchant sinkings, outpacing replacements, started to tilt the other way. The British Admiralty, watching tonnage charts in Whitehall, saw the crucial inflection in late 42. Sinking still terrible, but new ships suddenly arriving in numbers no one had imagined. Dönitz's carefully calculated campaign killed merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, began to fail. But to understand why, one must follow the steel dot in Pittsburgh and Youngstown. Blast furnaces that had once poured steel for skyscrapers now rolled plates for holes. In Detroit, auto plants refitted stamping presses to punch bulkhead panels. Turbine blades came from Ohio, rudders from Oregon, boilers from Wisconsin. Each Liberty ship was an industrial jigsaw puzzle. 250,000 parts, many arriving by rail from factories that had never before touched maritime work. Everything about the program was designed for speed. Prefabricated sections, built inland, shipped by train to coastal yards, craned into place like toy blocks. Welding replaced slow, expensive riveting. Flat-bottom hulls tolerated rough seas, but could be built on crude slipway. Even the engines were standardized triple expansion steam plants that any competent machinist could assemble. This distributed miracle meant that while U-boats prowled the Atlantic, America's interior, far beyond the range of any enemy bomber, was mass-producing the sea itself. By 1943, Kaiser's yards in Richmond and Portland were launching a Liberty every 3 days. So were Bethlehem Steel in Maryland, Newport News in Virginia, shipyards in Savannah, Jacksonville, New Orleans, Houston, Los Angeles. The record for a single yard belonged to California Shipbuilding in Los Angeles Harbor, 467 ships in just 4 years. German spies couldn't keep up. By the time an Observer report reached Berlin, the numbers had already doubled. It wasn't just speed, it was scale. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 2,710 Liberty ships. To imagine that, picture a continuous gray line of freighters stretching from New York to Boston, each 441 feet long, each hauling 10,000 tons of cargo, grain, trucks, tanks, locomotives, aircraft, fuel, entire armies afloat, and every ship was a floating rebuke to the Nazi economy. On board, crews found electric galleys, cold storage, radio direction finders, gyro compasses, humble but reliable technology that gave them reach and resilience. The Germans scoffed at their 11-knot top speed, but convoys don't race, they endure. A Liberty could carry enough food to feed a division for a month, or enough aviation fuel to power an air campaign, or enough locomotives to restore a French rail line in days. They were ugly, yes, but they were inexhaustible. The real shock came when captured German officers finally saw them with their own eyes. Autumn 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. Hauptmann Friedrich Radke stood behind a low fence, a cigarette smoldering, forgotten in his fingers. As a line of Liberty ships unloaded in the port of Houston just a few miles south, he had been captured in Tunisia months earlier and shipped across the Atlantic on one of those very vessels, a Peary-class freighter that still smelled of new paint and hot steel. He had spent the voyage counting rivets, cataloging weaknesses, confident that the U-boats would exact vengeance on their return trip. Yet the ship had reached America without so much as a periscope sighting. Now, behind him, the barracks buzzed with rumors. Another convoy in Galveston, another in Norfolk, another in New Orleans. Radke watched cranes swing steel containers off decks in hypnotic rhythm trucks. Fuel drums, locomotives, even small patrol boats shrink-wrapped in canvas. The sheer mass was dizzying. When he had joined Rommel's Afrika Korps, Germany's propaganda ministry had promised an industrial empire without rival. In school, he had been taught that America was chaotic, a land of jazz, unemployment, and broken factories. The Third Reich, he was told, was disciplined steel and inexhaustible order. But here, in this vast, humming port, Liberty ships arrived and departed like clockwork, and none of his fellow officers could explain how. 2,000 tons an hour, a guard said casually. When he saw Radke staring, the guard didn't boast. He didn't need to. Radke's cigarette fell from his fingers. Across America's inland rivers, the Liberty Fleet's shadow reached even farther. Barges rolled down the Mississippi loaded with Midwestern grain and Texas oil, feeding Atlantic convoys without pause. New yards opened on the Great Lakes, so German torpedoes could never threaten them. Trains brought prefabricated hulls from Kansas and Nebraska. Every Liberty ship was a proof of concept. War made modular. The U-boat war, once Germany's proudest weapon, was failing. In 1942, U-boats had sunk 609 Allied ships. By late 1943, despite more submarines than ever, they sank fewer than half that number. Escort carriers, long-range Liberator, patrol planes, sonar, and radar made Atlantic hunting grounds deadly. And still, even if a U-boat struck, 2 more Liberties left port for every 1 destroyed dot in Berlin. Dunitz stopped laughing. Radke and thousands of other POS absorbed this truth slowly. The camps weren't designed as classrooms, but they became ones. Prisoners on work detail near rail yards saw trains hauling endless ship parts, propeller blades the size of truck beds, boilers taller than houses. At night, the floodlit factories glowed white against the sky, a sight Germany had not known since before blackout curtains. One December evening, an American foreman at a Texas steel mill handed a German labor detachment their pay slips, 50 cents a day. The legal POW wage, the foreman joked through an interpreter. This furnace makes a ship's worth of steel every week. The German engineers among them swallowed hard. A single furnace One could feed more holes than Hamburg's entire district. The psychological collapse deepened aboard the ships themselves. By mid-1944, POW work teams were loading cargo onto Liberties bound for Europe. Tanks wrapped in wax paper, locomotives with chalk marks for assembly in France, aviation fuel in drums by the acre. They saw fresh keels being laid even as completed ships sailed past. There was no bottleneck, no shortage, no fear. Oberleutnant Hans Keller, once an ardent Nazi, described the revelation later. We were told the Americans were soft, incapable. Then we watched a ship roll off the ways every 3 days. We knew we had lost before the battles ended. The ships acquired their own folklore. Names mattered. Each Liberty bore a distinct one. SS John Adams, SS Booker T. Washington, SS Albert Gallatin. So many that German intelligence stopped trying to track them individually. Poes whispered about the Booker T, captained by an African-American merchant master, about the Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days. Nazi ideology cracked when men taught to sneer at racial inferiors, loaded crates under the quiet command of black American officers. By 1944, the numbers were crushing. Allied shipyards were launching so much new tonnage that even catastrophic convoy losses could be replaced in weeks. The Atlantic had turned from a battlefield into a pipeline. Every D-Day landing craft, every Sherman tank, every B-24 engine crossed on a Liberty or one of its faster cousins. And the prisoners saw the proof. Convoys thick enough to darken horizon. So many masts and stacks that the sea itself seemed paved in steel. Some evenings, in the camp recreation huts, guards let them listen to American radio. Swing music, war bond drives, and production reports read almost offhandedly. This week, American shipyards launched 38 merchant vessels, totaling 440,000 tons. Numbers so large, they defied comprehension. A German captain calculated on scrap paper and went pale. That is more than we built in 1943. In 1 week, for many. The realization was not just military, but existential. Nazi Germany had preached scarcity, that only conquest could secure Lebensraum and resources. America showed another path. Abundance created by free citizens in factories humming without compulsion. The Liberty ship was not beautiful, but it was democratic steel, and it sailed by the thousands. June 5, 1944, Southampton Water, England. The rain hissed across the anchored convoys, but the gray holes beneath it hardly noticed. Row after row of Liberty ships bobbed in the swell, each one stuffed to the bulkheads with everything needed to smash a continent's defenses. The decks of the SS Jeremiah O'Brien and the SS John W. Brown were stacked with Sherman tanks wrapped in tarpaulin. Jeeps chained in tight rows, crates of K-rations, jerrycans, radios, ammunition by the mile. Long gangways trembled under boots as men in olive drab poured aboard, mechanics, drivers, medics, engineers, British. Dock workers stopped to stare at the sight. The American solution to Germany's vaunted Atlantic wall floating patiently. At their wharves, a single Liberty ship could carry enough artillery shells to feed an army for weeks. Multiply by hundreds, and the numbers became surreal. By the evening before D-Day, over 1,200 Liberty and Victory ships had delivered men and materiel into Britain. They would continue like an industrial tide. Long after the first wave hit Normandy, for German planners, the nightmare had come true. Admiral Denitz's reports were grim. U-boats hunted and killed faster than they could be replaced. Allied shipbuilding had outstripped even wildest expectations. Mines, escort carriers, long-range patrols, and radar turned the North Atlantic from a German hunting ground into a graveyard. One statistic told the story. In 1942, every Liberty ship risked almost certain attack. In 1944, most reached port untouched. Production had tilted the ocean itself. The prisoners back in America heard about Normandy through camp loudspeakers, permitted by the Geneva Convention to relay news. But the real message wasn't the landings. It was the supply chain behind them. Entire ports were prefabricated in America and floated across the channel. Mulberries, artificial harbors the size of towns. Miles of underwater pipeline, Operation Pluto, carried fuel straight from English refineries to the beaches. Liberty ships fed them, a steel bloodstream pumping non-stop. At Camp Hearn and Camp Shelby. Some POs were assigned to unloading Liberty cargo arriving for the Pacific. Tractors, pontoon bridges, even entire railroads disassembled into labeled pieces. They handled stamped steel that read Detroit, Buffalo, Seattle. The cities might as well have been planets. They existed outside bomber range. Outside hunger, Hans Keller wrote home through censored Red Cross mail. They build ships as if baking bread. The censors let it pass. Perhaps they didn't care if German soldiers knew the truth. 4 men trained to believe in the invincibility of the Reich. The humiliation was a quiet, corrosive thing. Friedrich Radke later said the final crack came not from statistics, but from something ordinary. Coffee. On the SS Henry Bacon, where he worked as a POW stevedore, the American merchant sailors drank fresh coffee every watch. They threw away what cooled. We fought for oil and rubber and grain, Radke remembered. Here they pour wealth overboard. D-Day's aftermath only deepened the wound. Within weeks of the landings, Allied tonnage, ashore, fuel, food, vehicles, surpassed what Germany could move in a year. Liberty ships turned French ports into highways. The Red Ball Express convoys of trucks fed by Liberty carried fuel, chased Patton's tanks across France, faster than German maps could be redrawn. By August, U-boats that still dared sortie found convoys escorted by destroyer escorts and carrier aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere. In truth, they came from the same production miracle. The German Naval Command tried to adjust. They built new electro-boats, faster subs meant to strike back, but each took months and precious materials. America launched new freighters daily. The math was hopeless. By winter, even hardened SS officers admitted it. Letters intercepted by censors spoke openly. They have oceans of ships. We drown in them before battle. March 1945, Bremerhaven lay in ruins. Where once sleeky boats had slid into the North Sea, now shattered docks jutted like broken teeth. German officers, who had laughed at America's cheap ships in 1942, now stood watching. Allied convoys pour supplies into captured ports. Liberty hulls, with names like SS John W. Weeks and SS Robert E. Lee, nosed up to German quays while cranes, some brought whole from the States, swung down steel nets of crates. Jeeps, canned beef, boots, whole locomotives. A few weeks later, Berlin would fall. But here on the coast, the war was already mathematically finished. Naval engineer Klaus Thompson, who had once helped brief officers on how to sink Liberty ships, stood among other prisoners watching the unloading. He later told a U.S. interrogator, "We thought if we destroyed enough, America would tire and stop. But every ship we sank was replaced before it reached the bottom. You built more than we could count." The numbers were obscene. By Vede, the United States had launched 2,710 Liberty ships. Some took only 4 days from keel to sea. Each carried 9,000 tons. Wheat and shells, tanks and locomotives, whole factories in boxes. They fed Britain through the U-boat crisis, sustained the Soviet Union through Arctic convoys, and poured into North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the Pacific. Germany had no counter. Steel production starved for coking, coal, and alloy metals. Shipyards crippled by bombing. U-boat pens built at terrible cost, but starved of fuel and crews. The Reich that promised 1,000-year mastery could not outbuild a nation that treated shipbuilding like assembly line work. For the German prisoners in America, the realization was slow but final. They had seen lights across Texas, eaten food more lavish than officers at home, watched new trains built faster than their rail yards could repair one car. Now, through Red Cross bulletins and whispered news, they learned the Atlantic had become an American highway. Hans Radke, whose diary had begun in defiance, closed it with one final line in May 1945. "We have lost 2 factories." Back at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, workers cheered news of victory. Many had never seen the front. Some had never traveled beyond their county. Yet their welders, sparks and rivets, had crossed oceans, broken the back of the U-boat fleet, and starved the Reich of Hope. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda here. She was 1,000,000 real women who had built a fleet from nothing. The legacy was more than victory. In Hamburg and Bremen, where German engineers wandered the wreckage in stunned silence. Some quietly admitted respect. If we had built like this, one said, perhaps, and then stopped, because the truth was plain. Germany could not. Industrial democracy had proved stronger than authoritarian discipline. In the POW camps, repatriation began. Men who had once mocked American decadence now wrote polite thanks to camp commanders. Some applied to immigrate. Some did decades later. They carried home mental blueprints of mass production, logistics, and the quiet strength of abundance. The Liberty ships themselves sailed on for decades, some scrapped, some converted to peacetime trade, a few preserved. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, one of the DA veterans, still floats today in San Francisco, her decks echoing with the memory of convoys and Atlantic storms. Tourists walk her steel plates, not knowing that once German officers laughed at such ships, and then feared them. The moral is carved in steel rivets and shipyard timetables. No weapon frightened the Reich more than proof it could be outbuilt. Guns, tanks, even U-boats were finite. American production seemed infinite. Each Liberty ship was a floating message. You cannot sink faster than we can build. When the war ended, German officers faced a new reckoning. Their ideology had promised that discipline and racial destiny could overcome material odds. The Atlantic convoys said otherwise. Industrial democracy, with women in coveralls and assembly lines running night and day, had fed armies, bridged oceans, and buried tyranny under cargo manifests. May 8, 1945, V-Day, in Texas, where the first POW trains had arrived bewildered 2 years before, prisoners listened to the radio. Some wept, some sat silent. A few quietly hummed American songs learned in camp. They understood at last what had defeated them. They understood at last what had defeated them. Not just armies, but the ability of a free people to build, to supply, to outlast. The Liberty ships returned to port, flags snapping in the wind, holds empty for the first time in years. But their true cargo was the knowledge they had carried all along, that in modern war, steel and oil and logistics weigh heavier than ideology. One of the last diary entries found from a German naval officer after his capture read simply, "We believed in the U-boat war. We laughed at Liberty ships. Now the ocean itself belongs to America." And that is the final verdict. Not a single dramatic battle, but an unbroken chain of shipyard cranes, steel hulls, and relentless convoys. The laugh that began in 1942 died somewhere in the gray mid-at, smothered by the wake of thousands of merchantmen dot the Liberty ships, plain and unsung, won by existing faster than they could be destroyed. They turned a continent's hunger into surplus, a blockade into a highway, despair into inevitability. They proved that in a fight of endurance, freedom's factories can outbuild fear. When historians speak of decisive weapons, they name Spitfire, Sherman, Higgins' boat. But ask the men who faced them, and many will point instead to those squat, ugly freighters that came 3 a day, unstoppable. The ships Germany scorned until it drowned in their endless tide. This is the story of America's simplest, mightiest answer to tyranny: a welded hull, a merchant flag, and an ocean too full of ships to ever be stopped.